Hey, listener name. Have you ever, really stopped to think that the whole idea of a good job, it's kind of, I don't know, changing. And I don't just mean what jobs are out there, but the whole
Yeah.
deal. What's expected of us, what we get in return. It's a lot, right?
Yeah, no, it really is. And it's more than just a feeling, right? Like there are some
Mhm.
pretty big economic and social shifts happening that are changing the whole landscape of work, especially here in Canada.
Okay, so to really dig into all of this, we've
Mhm.
got some really interesting research lined up for this deep dive. We've got one source that really gets into how people are feeling about the whole, economic situation. And honestly, there's a lot of anxiety out there, but I think the real meat of what we're diving into today is this really in-depth report that Canada put out on federal labor standards. I think it's officially called the Report of the Expert Panel on Modern Federal Labor Standards, if I'm being totally accurate.
Yeah. And that report is super important because it's not just about the rules, like what's on the books right now. It actually digs into, the bigger picture of what a good job should look like in Canada today.
Okay, so not just checking boxes, but figuring out what we actually value in a job now.
Exactly.
Which, speaking of values, this report uses this thing called a GBA plus lens. And I'm not going to lie, when I first saw that, I was like, what is that? So break it down for us. What does that even mean?
It stands for Gender-Based Analysis Plus. Basically, it means that instead of thinking about the typical worker, and we all know who that makes us think of, right?
Right.
It means thinking about how these policies we're talking about, they might actually play out differently for different groups. So men, women, different racial backgrounds, people with disabilities, different incomes, you get the idea.
It's about making sure everyone has a voice at the table, right? When we're talking about these big, big topics.
Exactly. You can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to something as complex as work, right?
Yeah.
And the report really takes that to heart. They actually use that GBA plus lens throughout their whole analysis.
I like that. Okay, so let's unpack some of the stuff this report actually found about how work is, I don't know, shifting here in Canada. And honestly, some of it is a little alarming.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And it's worth keeping in mind that a lot of what Canada is going through is happening globally, right? We're not alone in this.
Right.
But the report really brings it home.
Yeah. So, for example, unionization rates, they've been going down for decades, right?
Yeah.
We're talking a 7 percentage point drop since 1981,
Wow.
which, to put that into perspective, only about 3 in 10 workers are unionized at this point.
Yeah.
And it's even lower if you just look at the private sector.
And even beyond unions, right? The report talks about wage stagnation as a huge key problem. And, it's something everyone's feeling right. But they actually have the data to back it up. So, yeah, household incomes have technically increased since the 70s. And this is but when you adjust for inflation,
Right.
they've barely gone up at all.
Yeah. It's like we're all running on a treadmill, working harder and harder,
Oh, it's the worst.
getting nowhere.
And to add insult to injury, right, those tiny income gains that have happened, they haven't been distributed evenly.
And then on top of all that, you have this huge increase in what the report calls non-standard work, which is all the part-time gigs, the contract work, the temporary jobs that never seem to end. Is that a Canadian thing or?
No, it's global. This is happening everywhere as the nature of work just changes. The OECD actually found that 60% of all job growth since the mid-90s has been in these non-standard jobs. So, yeah.
Okay, so this is big. We've got shrinking unions, wages are flatlining, more inequality, and more people stuck in these kind of shaky jobs. But are these trends all linked? What's the common thread here?
Well, that's where the report gets really interesting. They argue that it all comes back to this idea of decent work.
Okay, break that down for us. Decent work. What does that even mean?
So it's actually a term from the International Labor Organization, and it gets at, what should a job provide? And we're talking fair pay, job security, benefits, the chance to move up in your career, all that. It's the idea that a job shouldn't just be about surviving, but about living with dignity.
So it sounds like all of this stuff we've been talking about, the trends of chipping away at that idea of decent work.
Exactly. And the report's point is, if we want a fair, more equal society, we can't ignore this.
Totally. To make this really concrete, the report actually zooms in on a specific industry that I think most people probably don't think much about, which is trucking. Why trucking?
It seems random, But trucking is actually a really good example of all these bigger trends playing out. Plus, it's got some of its own, like, unique things going on that are worth looking at.
All right, let's get into it. What they find about trucking that was, like, really important.
Well, for one thing, there's a big difference between truckers who are hired directly by a company versus those who work through an agency.
Okay, so we're talking about different types of truckers. You've got the company drivers and then the agency ones. So what's the big deal? What's the difference? And why does it matter?
Well, with a company driver, they're like any other employee, right? They've got a boss,
Hmm.
a regular paycheck, maybe some benefits. But an agency driver, it's more like they're on their own, they're hustling for gigs, they might not know how much they're going to make week to week.
Less security.
Way less. And often, they're missing out on those basic worker protections that a lot of us take for granted.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then the report talked about this whole driver Inc. model. And I gotta be honest, I had never even heard of that before.
Yeah, it's kind of a newer thing.
So give it to me. What is that?
So basically, instead of being an employee, the driver is told, like, hey, incorporate yourself as a business.
Mm.
So on paper, they're their own boss.
Which, okay, at first that maybe sounds kind of cool. Like, oh, I'm an entrepreneur.
Right. Except it gets very blurry very quickly
Yeah, I can see that.
because it's often used to kind of like blur the lines around, are they a contractor or are they actually an employee in disguise? And that matters for things like how much they get paid, benefits, even who's liable if something goes wrong. It's a mess.
It sounds like a recipe for like taking advantage of people, especially if they maybe don't like know all the rules or they're just desperate for work and they'll sign anything.
Oh, absolutely.
Yep.
And because these driver Inc. arrangements can get super complicated with contracts and all that, it can be really hard to even track if they're getting paid properly
Yeah.
or even getting their legally required breaks. It's a nightmare to enforce.
And then to make things even more complicated, the report mentions that sometimes the temporary foreign worker program is used in trucking.
Yeah.
So how does that play into all of this?
Let's think about it. You're a worker. You're coming to a whole new country. Maybe you don't speak the language that well. Maybe you don't know the rules.
Right.
You're depending on that employer, not just for a paycheck, but maybe even to stay in the country,
Mhm.
right? That's a lot of power.
It creates a huge power imbalance.
Totally. It
Yeah.
makes it really hard to speak up, even if you know something's wrong.
You're stuck.
Yeah, exactly. And so the report kind of flags that as something we really need to look at more closely.
Makes sense. So we've talked about unions shrinking, these non-standard jobs on the rise, and now we're seeing how all of that actually plays out in the real world, in trucking.
And that's just one industry, right?
Yeah.
Imagine those same problems, but in construction, restaurants, cleaning services. Makes you think about decent work or the lack of it everywhere.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, one idea they propose is this: an independent low-wage commission.
Okay, so instead of politicians arguing about it every few years.
Exactly. You'd have this group of like experts who really study the low-wage economy, look at the data, and give recommendations.
Oh, so it's more evidence-based.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Take some of the politics out of it and focus on what actually works.
Right, which honestly, that whole idea of an independent commission kind of speaks to a bigger theme in the report.
Totally.
Like, we need to be way more nuanced and data-driven when we're talking about these labor issues.
100%. The report is full of data. It's not just opinions. They've got the numbers to back it up.
I like it. Okay, switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about something I think a lot of us can relate to, which is this feeling of being like constantly tethered to our phones, our laptops, checking work emails at all hours.
Oof, the worst.
Even when we're not technically at work, it's like that line has totally blurred.
Yeah, and that's the whole right to disconnect thing that everyone's talking about.
Right. And it's so tricky because it's not like you can just make a rule and suddenly it's solved.
Yep.
It's deeper than that.
It's cultural.
It's how we work now.
Exactly. And the report gets that. They don't come down hard on one side or the other. They get that employers have to be able to compete, right? Like, we're not in a bubble.
Right.
But it also highlights the risk to workers.
Mm-hmm.
Burnout, stress, never being able to actually switch off.
So it's like they're saying, hey, this is messy. There are no easy answers, but we have to figure out how to balance this.
Exactly. And I love that they actually ask some big questions like, what even is work in the digital age? Like, if I check my work email on the bus, is that work time?
Right. And that's something I think a lot of us are struggling with. No one has the answer.
And that whole right to disconnect thing,
Mm.
it also brings up this bigger question about benefits.
Which, as we know, is becoming a bigger and bigger problem as the whole traditional job thing kind of crumbles.
Totally. The days of working at one place your whole life, getting the gold watch and a pension,
Gone.
gone,
Yeah.
especially with these non-standard jobs.
Right. And the report really digs into this. Like, people in these non-standard jobs, they often have really limited access to benefits, or it's like they get something from one employer, but then they switch jobs and they lose it.
It's precarious, right?
It's a mess.
Yeah, it creates this two-tier system where if you're lucky enough to have that traditional job, you've got a safety net.
Right.
But if you're in this non-standard world, you're kind of on your own.
So what does the report say we should do about this whole benefits thing? Like, are there any solutions?
Well, one idea they bring up is this idea of portable benefits.
Okay, portable benefits. I've heard that term, but to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on it. What is that?
So imagine your benefits are like a backpack that you carry with you.
Okay.
Doesn't matter who you work for, those benefits are yours.
So instead of like your company providing health insurance or a retirement plan, it's more like you're contributing to a fund as an individual.
Right. And maybe your employer contributes to, or the government, but the point is you have it no matter what.
Full-time, part-time, freelance, whatever. That's amazing in theory. I'm sure there are challenges though,
Oh,
right?
tons.
Mm.
Like, who pays for all of this? And how do you actually run something like that? Big, complicated questions.
Yeah.
But the report argues it's something we need to look at seriously.
Yeah, especially as work changes, right? This idea of a job is so different now.
Totally. We might need new ways of doing things.
Right. And all of this whole benefits conversation, it kind of goes back to another big issue the report dives into, collective voice.
Right, which we kind of touched on earlier, but yeah.
So remind us, what is that again? And why does it matter so much right now?
So collective voice is basically just workers being able to speak up about the stuff that affects them. So wages, hours, safety, all that. Unions have traditionally been the way to do that.
Right. But as we know, unions are on the decline. So what do you do if you're a worker who wants to have a say but doesn't have a union?
Exactly. And the report is really clear. Collective voice is essential for fair work for everyone. They talk about all kinds of approaches, some traditional like unions, but also some newer, more creative models.
Okay. Like what? Give me an example.
So one they mentioned is the Status of the Artist Act.
The what? I have to admit, I'm drawing a blank. What is that?
So it's a Canadian law, and it's interesting because it recognizes that artists, they often work in this really unique way, right?
Freelancers, contractors?
Exactly. So this law lets them form associations that can then negotiate with, whoever they're working with, even if they're not technically employees.
Oh, so it gives them some bargaining power?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like a union, but for artists.
I like it.
It's about being flexible, finding ways to give workers a voice, no matter what their job is.
Right. And the report is basically saying, hey, the way we've always done things, it might not work anymore.
The world of work is changing faster than our laws can keep up.
Right. We need to keep thinking about this. And this whole idea of power imbalances between workers and employers.
Yeah.
The report does not shy away from that at all.
No, they're very upfront about it.
Which they offer some solutions, right? Like that independent commission we talked about.
Right.
To make things a little more level.
Exactly. Give workers more of a voice.
But then they go in this direction that I was not expecting. They start talking about short-term rentals.
Yeah. Seems random, but it actually connects back to this whole gig economy thing we've been discussing.
Okay, connect the dots for me.
Yeah.
How does Airbnb fit into all of this?
Well, platforms like Airbnb, they've just exploded in popularity, right?
Yeah.
And it's easy to see them as like, oh, that's convenient. I can rent a room or rent an apartment when I travel.
Right.
But what the report uncovers is that there's actually a lot more going on beneath the surface.
Like what?
It's huge, this whole market. The report actually says that on any given day in Canada, there are over 100,000 active Airbnb listings.
Whoa. That's a lot of places that could be like long-term rentals.
Right. That's what they're saying. It's a lot of potential housing being taken off the market.
And I'm guessing not all over Canada evenly. Where are these Airbnbs popping up?
Yeah, it's mostly the big cities, as you'd expect, like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. Almost half of all Airbnb activity in Canada is happening in those three cities alone.
Which, okay, those cities are already struggling with housing affordability.
Exactly. It's not helping. And here's the other thing that's interesting. It's not just, individual homeowners renting out that spare bedroom. The report actually found that almost half of Airbnb revenue in Canada is going to commercial operators.
Mm-hmm.
So these are companies that just manage like tons of listings.
So it's less sharing economy, more like mini hotels, basically.
Right. It's a business. And what's fascinating about that is it's not just about housing. It also changes the work that's happening. You've got all these property managers, cleaners, all these other jobs that exist. just to support this short-term rental market.
It's like this whole ecosystem.
Exactly
And
right.
I wonder, like, what happens to a neighborhood, a community, when more and more homes are just for tourists, not for people who actually live there?
Right, and that's a huge question.
Yeah.
The report talks about this thing called FREH listings, which stands for frequently rented entire home listings.
Okay, so not just a room, but the whole place is an Airbnb.
Exactly. And they estimated there were over 30,000 of these FREH listings in Canada just last year. It's a lot.
That is a lot. And the report kind of suggests this is spreading beyond just the big cities, too, right?
Oh, yeah. Smaller towns, even rural areas, are seeing this boom in short-term rentals, which, it could be good. It brings in money,
Right?
but it can also make it even harder for locals to find a place to live.
It's almost like this weird side effect of the gig economy, right? Like Airbnb was supposed to be about empowering individuals, but it's having these huge ripple effects that no one really planned for.
It's complicated. But that's why I think this report is so cool, because it's not like Airbnb is bad,
Mm.
but it just raises all these questions we need to think about.
It's about finding that balance, right? Like,
Yeah.
how do we enjoy these new technologies, but also protect communities and make sure everyone has a place to live?
Exactly. And that kind of brings us back to the theme of this whole deep dive, right?
Mm.
How is work changing? And how does that impact all of this?
Yeah. We covered a ton today, listener name. We talked about unions shrinking, wages not budging, the gig economy exploding, the whole benefits mess, and even Airbnb and the housing market.
A lot.
It's a lot. But it all points back to these like big, almost philosophical questions about the future of work, you know?
Totally. Like, what even is a good job these days?
Right.
And how do we make sure people are taken care of, even if the way we work looks different than it used to?
Exactly. And the reports we looked at today, they don't have all the answers, but they give us some good data and some different ways of thinking about things.
To start the conversation.
Exactly. So, listener name, as we wrap up here, what stuck with you? What new things did you learn today?
What questions do you have about the future of work? For yourself, for your community?
Keep learning, keep asking those questions, and definitely keep talking about it because the future of work is being decided now.
Thanks for diving deep with us, listener name.
We'll catch you next time for another deep dive.